If you're moving to the Seattle area and you're already browsing Zillow, saving homes, and comparing different neighborhoods, I want you to hit pause for just a minute. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make isn't buying the wrong house. It's starting their home search before they've answered a few really important questions. I've worked with a lot of people relocating to the Seattle area, and it's actually pretty common for someone to fly in, convinced that they wanted one city, and then they completely change their mind after spending a few days exploring different neighborhoods. And that's because finding the right home isn't just about your budget. It's about making sure the home actually fits the life you want once you get here. So before you buy a house anywhere in the Seattle area, here are the 8 questions I think every buyer should answer first. What is your commute actually going to look like? One of the first questions I ask people that are moving here is, where are you actually going to be driving during the week? Because it's really easy to fall in love with a house and assume the commute will just work itself out. But in my experience, that's one of the biggest reasons people end up regretting where they bought. I actually worked with a buyer a while back who purchased a home in Port Orchard. On paper, it made a lot of sense. They were able to get much more house for their money, and Port Orchard is just across the Puget Sound from West Seattle with a ferry connecting the two. Before they bought, we talked through the commute, we looked at the ferry schedule, the cost, and what the trip would look like day to day. Everything seemed reasonable at the time. But once they actually started living there and making that commute every day, it turned out to be much more draining than they expected. Between driving to the ferry, waiting to board, crossing the water, and then continuing into Seattle, it just became too much. About 6 months later, they decided to sell the home and ended up taking a loss. That experience really reinforced something I've seen over and over again. It's one thing to understand a commute on paper, and it's another thing to actually live it 5 days a week. So if you're relocating to Seattle, don't just plug the address into Google Maps once and call it good. If you can, drive the commute at the same time of day you'll actually be traveling. Better yet, rent an Airbnb in the neighborhood you're considering for a few days and experience what life there really feels like. I always love it when buyers take that extra step because it gives them confidence they're not just buying the right house. They're buying in a location that fits their daily routine, their patience, and the lifestyle they're hoping to have once they get here. If you're relocating to Seattle and you're trying to figure out which neighborhoods actually make sense for your commute, your budget, and the lifestyle you want, I'd be happy to help. This is exactly what I do with buyers all the time. We can jump on a quick Zoom call, talk through your priorities, narrow down the areas that fit what you're looking for, and make sure you're spending time researching the right places instead of trying to look at every city around Seattle. You can reach out using the contact information on the screen or in the description below. And I'd love to help make your move to the Seattle area as smooth as possible. All right, let's get into question number 2. What do you want your weekends to look like? The next question I want you to ask yourself is, what do you actually want to be close to? And I don't just mean the things you'll do once or twice a year. I mean the places and activities you're realistically going to on a regular basis. Hey, I'm a huge Seahawks fan myself, so I get it. If you've got season tickets and you're heading to games all season long, maybe living a little closer to downtown is something worth considering. But if you're only making that trip 8 or 10 times a year and the rest of the year you're commuting to work, taking the kids to school, walking the dog, or running errands, those everyday routines are probably going to have a way bigger impact on how much you enjoy where you live. I've worked with plenty of clients who love going to Seahawks games, Mariners games, concerts, and other events in the city. They enjoy having easy access when they want it, but they also like coming home to a quieter, more residential neighborhood. For them, driving into the city for those events is a trade-off they're perfectly happy to make. That's why I always encourage buyers to think about how often they'll actually use the things that are important to them. If it's something you'll do once a month or a handful of times a year, maybe it's not worth making that your biggest priority. When you pull into your driveway after work, what do you want to see outside your front door? Do you picture walking to restaurants and coffee shops, taking the kids to a neighborhood park, walking the dog on nearby trails, spending weekends out on the lake, or having a larger backyard? Or maybe you just want a little more peace and quiet after a busy day. Once you answer that question, you'll probably find yourself crossing quite a few cities off your list. And honestly, that's a good thing. It's a lot easier to focus your search once you know what matters most to you instead of trying to make every neighborhood work. I think a lot of buyers feel like they need to keep every option on the table, but in my experience, your search actually gets a whole lot easier once you start eliminating places that don't match what you want. How much more home could you get by adjusting your commute? This is actually one of my favorite exercises to do with buyers who are relocating to Seattle. We'll pull up a map, figure out where they're going to be working, and then start exploring what happens if we move the search a little bit north, a little bit south, a little east or west. Sometimes I'll say, okay, what if we added another 15 or 20 minutes to your commute? It's always fun to see what happens. Maybe that extra drive gets you another 1,000 square feet. Maybe it gets you a 3-car garage instead of a 2-car garage. Maybe you end up with a much larger lot, a newer home, or a neighborhood that checks a few more boxes. Then we compare the trade-offs. Is that extra space worth another 20 minutes in the car each day? Or would you rather have a shorter commute and give up some of that square footage? There isn't a right or wrong answer. It's just really about understanding what you're getting in exchange for more driving and whether it's worth it for you. I love doing this exercise because it helps buyers visualize the different options instead of just guessing what might be possible. And if you'd like to walk through this exercise with me, I'd be happy to help. We can hop on a quick Zoom call, plug in your work location, your budget, and your priorities, and see how your options change as we explore different parts of the Seattle area. It's a simple exercise, but it's one that's helped a lot of my clients narrow down where they should be looking. What monthly payment are you actually comfortable with? This question naturally builds on the last one because sometimes moving just a little farther from where you work can help you find a much better balance between the home you want, the commute you're comfortable with, and a monthly payment that fits your budget. When I work with buyers, I actually like working backwards. Instead of starting by looking at houses, we start with the financial side of the equation. We'll talk about things like your down payment, the type of loan you're using, the property tax and insurance estimates, and most importantly, what's your monthly payment you're actually comfortable with. Notice I said comfortable, not the maximum amount that a lender says you can afford. Once we have that number, everything else starts to fall in place. From there, we can look at the market and figure out which areas are most likely going to get you close to that monthly payment while also checking the boxes that matter most to you. Maybe you need 4 bedrooms because you're planning for a growing family. Maybe having a home office is a non-negotiable. Maybe you'd rather have a newer home than a bigger yard. Everyone's priorities are a little bit different. That's why I don't think it makes sense to start by searching every neighborhood around Seattle. I think it makes a lot more sense to understand your budget first and then narrow down the search to the areas that give you the best chance of finding the home you're actually looking for. It saves a lot of time, avoids a lot of frustration, and helps you focus on homes that make sense for both your lifestyle and your finances. How long do you actually plan on staying? This is a question that I don't think gets asked nearly enough, but it can completely change the advice I'd give you. Before you answer, I want you to think about which one of these 3 categories you fall into. Are you buying a home you'll probably own for around 3 years? Are you looking for more of a 5 to 7 year home? Or are you buying something that you hope will be your forever home, or at least somewhere you'll stay for 10 years or more? Because my advice is going to be a little different depending on which category you're in. If you think this is only going to be a 2 or 3 year home, I'd spend a little extra time thinking through whether buying is the right move today or if renting for a year or 2 makes more sense. That gives you time to learn the area, experience different neighborhoods, and make a more confident long-term decision before putting down roots. If you do decide to buy, I'd pay a little more attention to the neighborhood you're choosing and the type of home you're buying in, since your timeline is shorter. I've also seen that new construction works really well for some buyers in this situation. By the time you've owned the home for a few years, the neighborhood often feels more established, the homes are finished, the construction activity is gone, the landscaping is filled in, and your home is still relatively new compared to many resale homes on the market. On top of all that, builders frequently offer incentives like temporary rate buy downs or other financing programs that can help lower your monthly payment during those first few years. Now, if you're planning to stay somewhere between 5 and 7 years, that's really what I consider the sweet spot. It gives you enough time to settle into the neighborhood, build equity, spread out your closing costs, and ride through some of the normal ups and downs that happen in the housing market. If someone asked me what timeline I generally like to see before buying a home, this would probably be my answer. Now, if you're buying a home you expect to stay in for 10 years or longer, that's a completely different conversation. At that point, I'm much less concerned about what the market does over the next year or two. Historically, homeowners who have owned property in the Seattle area over longer periods have often seen meaningful appreciation. Even though markets go through cycles and future appreciation, of course, is never guaranteed. So instead of trying to perfectly time the market, I'm much more focused on helping you buy a home that you'll still enjoy living in 10 years from now. That's why I always ask buyers this question early on in the process. Your timeline can completely change which neighborhoods, homes, and even financing options make the most sense for you. What is your biggest non-negotiable? By this point, we've talked about your commute, your budget, your lifestyle, and how long you plan on staying. Now I want you to ask yourself one simple question. What's the one thing you're not willing to compromise on? I found that once buyers can answer that question, the search becomes a whole lot easier. I remember working with one buyer whose biggest priority was having a mountain view. He told me, "I want to be able to sit in my dining room and see as far as possible." That was his dream. To make that happen, he ended up giving up some lot size. And he was completely happy with that decision because every time he sat down for dinner or had friends over, he got exactly what he wanted. On the other hand, maybe your biggest priority is having a large backyard for your kids or dogs. Or maybe your dream is a brand new construction home. Well, most newer communities tend to have smaller lots, so that's another trade-off you might decide is worth making. The point is, almost every buyer has to make some compromises. The key is making sure you're compromising on the things that matter the least, not the things that you think about every single day. That's why one of the first things I do with clients is make a list of their non-negotiables. Then we can compare different cities, different neighborhoods, and see which ones give you the best chance of giving the things that matter most while making the fewest compromises. It's a really fun process because once you know your priorities, you'll be surprised how quickly the list of neighborhoods starts to narrow itself down. Honestly, this is my favorite part of helping relocation clients. Once we figure out your commute, your budget, and your non-negotiables, it's amazing how quickly we can narrow down a search from dozens of neighborhoods down to just a handful that really fit what you're looking for. If you'd like to go through that process with me, we can jump on a Zoom call and map everything out together. Have you actually experienced the neighborhood? This one is pretty simple, but I think it's one of the most overlooked questions people can ask themselves. It's really easy to schedule a few home tours on a Saturday afternoon where the weather's nice, but that's probably not when you're gonna spend most of your time there. If you can visit the neighborhood on a weekday morning, drive the commute, stop by after work, see what traffic is like, walk around after dinner, visit the grocery store you'd actually shop at, and grab dinner nearby. Take the dog for a walk or visit the closest park if that's important to you. You'll learn a lot more about what it's actually like to live there than you ever will from scrolling through Zillow or Google Maps. If you're relocating from out of state and you can't do that, consider spending a long weekend there. Rent an Airbnb, experience the neighborhood firsthand, and live like a local for a couple of days. I've had buyers completely change their minds after doing this. Sometimes it's because they found a neighborhood they liked even more than they expected. Other times, they just realized an area they were convinced they'd love just wasn't the right fit once they experienced it in person. It's a small investment of time and, of course, a little bit of money, but it can save you from making a much bigger mistake later. Have you answered these questions before you start house hunting? If you've made it this far, you've probably realized something. Finding the right home isn't really the hard part. The hard part is figuring out what you're actually looking for before you ever start browsing listings. Once you've thought through your commute, your lifestyle, your monthly payment, how long you plan on staying, your biggest non-negotiables, and you've spent time experiencing the neighborhoods you're considering, the home search becomes a whole lot easier. Instead of trying to compare hundreds of homes across dozens of different cities, you're focusing on a handful of areas that actually fit the way you want to live. And that's exactly what I try to help my relocation clients do. We spend a little more time planning up front so that when the right home comes on the market, you can move forward with confidence instead of wondering if you should be looking somewhere else. I hope these 8 questions help you make your move to the Seattle area a little easier. And if you'd like some help answering them, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to hop on a Zoom call, talk through your situation, and help you narrow down the neighborhoods that make the most sense for you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.